The hammer fell from Sarah Talmadge's hand and landed in the dirt with a dull, defeated thud. She stood 6 feet from Martin Brooks, her chest heaving, sawdust in her hair, sweat cutting clean lines through the grime on her cheeks. Behind her, the framing of her room was already rising against the eastern wall of his cabin. Pine boards, hand-cut and hauled 3 miles from the sawmill in Colton Creek, stood upright in the afternoon sun like a declaration of war. Or of something far more dangerous than war. Martin had not moved from his doorway. His jaw was set. His eyes, the color of weather-beaten cedar, were fixed on her with an expression she could not entirely name. Fury, yes, but underneath the fury, something cracked and frightened. "I told you," he said, and his voice was low and controlled in the way that a river is controlled right before it floods. "I told you there is no room here. Not for you, not for any partner. I said those exact words, Sarah." She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching 3 weeks ago. Around the same time she had stopped apologizing for wanting to live. "You said there was no room," she replied, bending slowly and picking the hammer back up. Her knuckles whitened around the handle. "So I am making room." He crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides and wrapped his hand around her wrist, not hard, not cruel, but absolutely certain. His fingers were rough with years of rope and iron and cold. His voice dropped even lower, and that was somehow worse than shouting. "If you knew what I was hiding inside that cabin," he said, "you would not want to be within 100 miles of it, or of me." Her eyes searched his face. She found the thing she had been tracking for weeks, the dark thing underneath the silence and the refusals and the shuttered windows at midday. She found terror. "Then tell me," she whispered. "Tell me what is so terrible about yourself that a woman with a hammer frightens you." He released her wrist. He stepped back, and for one long moment he looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark, not sure whether the ground he could not see was 2 inches below his feet or 200. Then he turned, walked back inside his cabin, and shut the door. Sarah Talmadge stood in the Montana dust in the summer of 1883, looked at the framing of the room she had already begun to build, and picked her hammer back up. She had not come this far to stop now. 6 weeks earlier, Sarah had arrived in Harding Flats, Montana Territory, on the back of a freight wagon that smelled of pickled pork and printer's ink. She was 26 years old, which meant she was old enough to have buried a husband, old enough to have rebuilt herself from the rubble of that burial, and young enough to believe the rebuilding had been worth the effort. Her husband, James Talmadge, had died of a fever in St. Louis in the winter of 1881. He had been a kind man, a printer by trade, with ink-stained fingers and a laugh that echoed. She had loved him genuinely and grieved him genuinely. And then, because she was fundamentally a woman of forward motion, she had grieved her way all the way west. It was not a man she was looking for when she came to Montana. People assumed otherwise, and she had grown tired of correcting them. What she was looking for was land of her own, a parcel, a purpose, a place in the world that could not be taken from her the way a man could be taken by fever or bad luck or the simple cruelty of time. She had a little money from the sale of the print shop. Not much, but enough to get started, if started meant hammering posts into frozen ground and eating a lot of hardtack while the ground thawed. She had arrived in Harding Flats on a Tuesday, found the land office, and learned that the parcel she had written ahead to claim had already been sold to a cattle company out of Denver. The land agent, a pink man named Dortmund with a sympathetic wince, had told her there was one remaining homestead plot north of town, 2 miles past the tree line. "Fair amount of work to it," Dortmund said carefully. "I like work," she said. He had given her the description of the parcel, and then cleared his throat in a particular way that told her there was something he was not quite saying. "There is a neighboring claim," he said, "directly adjacent to the east boundary of your parcel. Fella by the name of Brooks has been there going on 4 years. He is—" Dortmund paused, reshuffled some papers unnecessarily. "He keeps to himself." "So do I," Sarah said. Dortmund winced again. "Just so you know." She found her parcel easily enough, following the creek north until it bent east through the pines. The land was good, better than Dortmund had suggested, which made her suspicious of his motives for undervaluing it, but that was a problem she could circle back to. There was a natural meadow, a spring that ran clean and cold, and a slope of south-facing hillside that would catch the light in winter. She walked every yard of it and felt the particular satisfaction of standing on ground that was hers, legally, officially, incontrovertibly hers. Then she walked the eastern boundary and found the cabin. It was built well, better than well. Whoever had put it up had not been hasty or careless. The logs were tight and level, the chinking clean, the roof steeply pitched for snow. There was a porch, simple but solid, and a corral with 2 horses and a mule that all looked healthy and fed. A kitchen garden ran along the south wall. Someone was taking good care of this place, and that same someone had, at some point in the recent past, placed that kitchen garden approximately 4 feet across the boundary line onto what was now officially Sarah's land. She stood at the edge of the garden for a moment, looking at the neat rows of beans and squash and something leafy she could not immediately identify. Then she walked up to the cabin door and knocked. Martin Brooks answered the door the way a man answers a door when he is not expecting anyone, and has specifically arranged his life so that no one ever comes. He was tall, a full head above her, with dark hair in need of cutting and the kind of face that had once been open and had since been carefully, deliberately closed. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his forearms were cross-hatched with old scars that she would later learn were from a fire and not, as she initially and briefly thought, from something worse. He looked at her. He looked past her at the empty meadow, as if checking to confirm she had not brought an army with her. Then he looked back at her. "Can I help you?" he said. It was not an unfriendly question. It was a question asked by a man who had already, in the half-second after opening the door, decided that whatever she needed, the answer was no. "I am your new neighbor," she said. "My name is Sarah Talmadge. I have just filed on the parcel to your west." Something moved across his face too fast for her to catch it. "The Mercer parcel. Dortmund at the land office called it Lot 14. I do not know the previous holder's name." "Mercer," he said it flatly. "Mercer sold it. Mercer's widow did. In the spring, according to Dortmund. I bought it last month by correspondence." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the strange sense that he was processing something that went well beyond the simple fact of a new neighbor. He looked out at the meadow again with an expression that was not quite grief but was in the same family. "Well," he said finally, "the land is good." "I know it is. I have already walked it." She paused. "Your kitchen garden is about 4 feet onto my side of the boundary." His jaw tightened fractionally. "I know. I am not asking you to move it today." "Good." The silence stretched between them. A hawk turned wide, slow circles over the meadow. The mule in the corral made a sound of mild complaint. "I will not be a bother to you," Sarah said. "I intend to build a soddy first for shelter and then a proper structure once I have the lumber and the funds for it. I expect my nearest neighbor and I can manage to share a territory this size without causing each other any trouble." "I expect so," he said. His voice was neutral in a way that required effort. "Good then," she said, and turned to walk back across the meadow. "Miss Talmadge." She turned back. He was still in the doorway, and the afternoon light was doing something complicated behind him, and for the first time she noticed that his eyes were really rather extraordinary. The color of weathered wood, yes, but with a depth to them, a quality of having seen too much and decided to go on seeing anyway. "The spring on the east end of your land runs from the same source as mine," he said. "If you dam it or divert it, it affects me." "I was not planning to dam it," she said. "But thank you for the information." She built her soddy in 10 days. It was not a pretty structure. Sod was a material that resisted prettiness, but it was sound, and it kept the weather out, and it had a proper wood door with a latch she had made herself from a piece of strap iron she had traded a pair of gloves for at the general store in Colton Creek. She slept in it the first night with the satisfaction of a woman who has solved a problem through the application of direct labor. The nearest town, Colton Creek, was 7 miles south. Harding Flats, which was really more of a cluster of permanent ambitions than an actual town, was 2 miles closer. Between them there was a church, a mill, a blacksmith, a general store that doubled as a post office, and a saloon that tripled as everything else. Sarah went to town every week for supplies and slowly learned the social landscape. She learned that Martin Brooks was a man of considerable local reputation, not all of it fully understood. He had come to Harding Flats 4 years ago from somewhere east that he never specified. He had built his cabin alone in 4 months, which people acknowledged with respect. He traded in furs and had a contract with the land company to break horses, which he did in a corral behind the trees where nobody could watch him, which people found puzzling. He was not rude in town, but he was efficient. He got what he needed and left with the speed of a man with somewhere to be and a horror of being detained. He had never, in 4 years, had a woman to supper. Sarah learned this particular fact from a woman named Edna Crane, who ran the boarding house in Colton Creek and had the comprehensive knowledge of local affairs that comes with operating the one business through which everyone eventually passes. "Not that he is not pleasing to look at," Edna said, refilling Sarah's coffee cup. "He just does not seem to be a man who is looking." "He is not my concern," Sarah said. Edna gave her a look that was perfectly pleasant and completely disbelieving. In her 3rd week on the land, Sarah's most urgent problem became timber. She had enough money for lumber, but getting it hauled from the mill in Colton Creek to her parcel was going to cost her nearly a third of what she had left. She spent 2 evenings doing and redoing her figures, and both evenings arrived at the same conclusion. She could afford to build a proper cabin, but only if she kept the structure small and did at least half the labor herself. She was measuring her lot and figuring dimensions one morning when Martin Brooks appeared at the edge of her meadow. He had his mule with him and a coil of rope over one shoulder, and he looked like a man who had come out here for a completely different reason and was mildly surprised to find her working. "There is a stand of pine down by the East Fork," he said without preamble. "Deadfall mostly from a fire 3 years back, already dry, you would not have to season it." She straightened up from her measuring and looked at him. "That is on your land. Most of it is on the boundary. Some of it might be on yours." He adjusted the rope on his shoulder. "I would not charge you for the timber itself. Hauling is your problem." She calculated the offer in 3 seconds. It was a good offer. It was a better offer than she had any particular reason to expect from a man who had not smiled at her once in 3 weeks, which meant possibly that there was something he wanted from it, and she needed to know what that was before she agreed. "What do you need?" she asked directly. He seemed briefly startled by the directness, then settled back into his usual expression, which was carefully neutral. "My south fence needs reinforcing before winter. The posts are starting to heave. If you can help me repost 100 yards of it, that would be fair exchange for the timber," she considered. 200 yards of fence for a full stand of seasoned timber. 150, he said. "Done," she said. They worked the fence line together for 3 days. It was hard, physical work pulling old posts, augering new holes, setting new cedar posts in the rocky Montana soil, and it was the kind of work that strips away the possibility of pretending. You cannot maintain a careful social distance from someone when you are both straining against the same iron bar trying to break loose a post that has been in the ground for years. You cannot keep a controlled expression when a blister opens on your palm and you breathe hard through your teeth, and the person standing next to you notices and does not comment, just hands you a strip of clean cloth from his pocket without being asked. She wrapped the cloth around her palm. He went back to the post he was working. "How did you come to be here alone?" he asked, later in the afternoon. It was not a prying question. It was asked in the tone of a man who had thought about whether to ask it and decided it was fair, given the circumstances. "My husband died," she said, 2 years ago, St. Louis. I am sorry. He was a good man. We had 3.5 good years." She paused. "He would have laughed himself breathless at the sight of me reposting fence in Montana. Would that have been a bad thing?" "No," she said, and found herself almost smiling. "He had an excellent laugh." Martin said nothing for a moment. He drove a post with 3 heavy strokes. "What brought you to Montana specifically?" "Land," she said. "My own land, something that cannot be taken." She glanced at him. "I expect you understand that." He looked at her then, a real look, not the careful surface checking he usually did, but a look that went somewhere deeper. "Yes," he said. "I understand that." They did not speak again for another half-hour. But something had shifted. She could feel it. The way you feel the temperature of a room change before anyone opens a window. She hauled her timber over the following week, making 6 round trips with a rented horse, and a flat wagon she borrowed from the blacksmith's brother in exchange for 2 days of help tallying his winter inventory. The logs were good, dry, and straight, exactly as Martin had promised. She stacked them beside her soddy and began planning her cabin in earnest. It was at this point that she made the decision that would change everything. Her parcel had natural boundaries on 3 sides, the creek to the west, the tree line to the north, the slope to the south. The best building site, the most sheltered and most practical, was in the northeast corner of the meadow. And the northeast corner of the meadow was approximately 20 feet from the eastern wall of Martin Brooks's cabin. She told herself this was purely practical, and it was, partly. The proximity to the spring, the shelter from the north wind provided by the cabin's windbreak effect, the access to the existing trail she could see running between his cabin and the road to Colton Creek. All of these were legitimate, verifiable reasons to build exactly where she was planning to build. She told herself this, and it was true, and it was not the whole truth, and she knew it. She began laying the foundation the first week of August, 1883. She cleared the site, leveled it, and laid her sill logs with the careful precision of someone who knows that everything built afterward depends on the truth of what is built first. She was 2 days into the work when Martin came out of his cabin in the morning and stopped on his porch and looked at the progress she had made. The look on his face was not anger. It was something more complicated than anger. It was the look of a man watching something happen that he had told himself would not happen, and had been secretly dreading would happen, and could not decide whether the dread was the bad kind or the kind that lives right next to something else entirely. He came to the edge of his property and looked at her foundation. He looked at the angle of the walls she had set out with stakes and string. He looked at the distance between her planned eastern wall and his existing western wall. "You are going to build right there," he said, not a question. "I am," she said. "That is 20 feet from my cabin." 19 and a half, she said, "by my measurement." He was quiet for a long moment. "Miss Talmadge, I think I should be plain with you." "Please be," she said. He looked at her with those deep, complicated eyes. "I am not a man who does well with neighbors, particularly close ones. I came out here specifically to be alone, and I have been alone here for 4 years, and that arrangement suits me. I do not have room in my life for the complications that come with proximity. I do not have room for a partner of any kind in this work or in anything else. I think it would be better for both of us if you built on the far western side of your parcel, near the creek." She listened to all of this very carefully. Then she said, "The creek floods in spring. I know because I can see the watermark on the cottonwood trunks, and the western slope gets no afternoon shelter and would be brutal in winter. The best building site on my land is the northeast corner, and I have the right to build on my own land where I see fit." "You have the legal right," he said. "I am asking you as a neighbor." "And I have heard you," she said. "I am sorry, Mr. Brooks, but this is where I am building my cabin." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned and went back inside, and the door closed with a quiet precision that was somehow more emphatic than a slam. She went back to laying her foundation. For the next 10 days, she worked on her cabin and he worked on his land, and they did not speak. She could see him sometimes, through the trees or across the space between the 2 structures, going about his work with the focused, contained energy of a man who is deliberately not looking in a particular direction. She observed this without comment and kept working. She had finished the sill logs and begun raising her wall logs, an ambitious project for a single person, requiring a system of log jacks and a lot of cursing under her breath, when she encountered a problem she could not solve alone. The north wall required a log that was too heavy for one person to manage with a jack in the rocky soil. She tried 3 times and the log slid dangerously each time, and on the third try she had to throw herself clear of it and landed hard on her back in the dirt and lay there for a moment staring up at the blue Montana sky, thinking very specific thoughts about her situation. She got up, brushed herself off, and walked to Martin's door. She knocked. He opened it. He looked at her, at the dirt on her back, at her expression. "I need help with one log," she said. "I am not asking for anything more than an hour of your time. I will give you a day's labor on whatever you need in exchange." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped off his porch and followed her without a word. Together they raised the log in 20 minutes. He was strong and he knew how to work with someone. There was a quality of attention in the way he positioned himself relative to her movements, a kind of physical consideration that she noticed and filed away. When they set the log in place and she checked it level, she straightened up to find him looking at the rest of her framing with an expression that was not quite what she expected. "Your north-south spacing is off by an inch on the 3rd row," he said. She looked. He was right. "I know," she said. "I will correct it on the next tier." "You should correct it now or it compounds." She looked at him. "Are you offering to help me correct it?" He seemed to realize what he had just implied, and something crossed his face that was very close to embarrassment. "I am pointing out a structural issue," he said. "As a neighbor," she said. "As someone who does not want a badly built structure collapsing in the first hard wind and the rubble blowing onto my property," he said. She smiled. She could not help it. It was the first smile she had directed at him that was not careful or measured, just a genuine, amused, unhidden smile. And she saw what it did to him. She saw the small, involuntary softening around his eyes, immediately controlled, immediately tucked back behind the wall, but there, undeniably there. "Well," she said, "in the interest of your property, then." They spent the rest of the afternoon fixing her 3rd wall tier together. He did not explain why he had taken his work shirt off, and she did not explain why she kept not looking at the scars on his arms and then looking at them anyway. The scars ran from his left elbow to the back of his left hand and curled at the edges the way fire scars do, puckered and pale against the tan of the rest of his skin. They were old. They were significant. She said nothing about them. That evening, standing at her soddy with a cup of coffee she had brewed on her small stove, she looked at the framing of her cabin and felt, for the first time since arriving in Montana, something like the solid ground of the future. And when she looked east, she could see the warm yellow light in the single window of Martin Brooks's cabin, and she felt something else too, something quieter, more uncertain, more troubling in the best possible way. Over the next 2 weeks, a rhythm developed that neither of them acknowledged directly, because acknowledging it would have required talking about it, and talking about it would have required deciding what it was. He helped her for an hour or two most evenings after he finished his own work. She helped him with fencing and splitting wood on the weekends. They worked in the particular silence of 2 people who are communicating a great deal without words, a silence full of attention and small adjustments, and the accumulation of small, observable facts about another person. She learned that he took his coffee without sugar. She learned that he was a careful and precise worker who hated wasted effort and had a particular, barely visible satisfaction when something came out right. She learned that, when he was thinking through a problem, he pressed his thumbnail against the center of his lower lip. She learned that he had a sense of humor that was so dry it was almost invisible, delivered in a voice so flat that she thought at first she had misheard him, and then laughed 3 seconds later when it landed. He learned things about her too. She could tell by the way he looked at her sometimes, cataloging something, adding it to whatever record he was keeping. He learned that she was not easily discouraged, and that this was not stubbornness, but something more fundamental, a quality of belief, that the next problem also had a solution. He learned that she sang to herself when she was working alone, not performing, just singing, and that she stopped when she noticed him and did not seem embarrassed but simply chose silence, the way you might close a book when company came. He learned that she had opinions about everything from fence post depth to territorial politics, and that she held those opinions with an easy certainty that was completely different from arrogance, because she changed her mind immediately and gracefully when presented with better information. He learned these things, and she knew he was learning them, and neither of them said a word about any of it. Her cabin walls were rising steadily. She had the north and south walls to their full height, and had started the east and west walls when she made a structural discovery that stopped her cold on a Tuesday morning in mid-August. Her original plan had the cabin at 16 by 20 feet, a practical size for one person, good bones, enough room. But when she set out the east wall's final dimension, she realized that the way the roof line would fall, her intended doorframe placement created a sight line problem with her loft. She stood in the middle of the structure for an hour, looking at it, running numbers, trying to find a way to make the plan work. The solution was to push the east wall out by 10 feet and add a secondary room, a sleeping room or a workroom, that would jog slightly to the east. It was not a complicated addition architecturally, but it changed the footprint significantly, and the footprint had one very specific implication. If she added the east room, her cabin would extend to within 8 feet of Martin Brooks's cabin. Not 19 and a half. 8. She turned this over in her mind for the better part of 2 days. She went over her plans. She stood at the boundary and looked at both structures. She sat at her soddy table in the evenings and did calculations she was technically doing about roof lines and load-bearing walls, but was actually doing about something else entirely. On Thursday morning, she started laying the foundation for the east room. She had the sill logs laid and was beginning to think about the framing when Martin came out of his cabin and saw what she was doing. He walked over, looked at the new foundation, looked at the distance between his wall and where her east wall would now stand, and then looked at her. "What is this?" he said. "A room," she said. "Onto the side of my cabin." "Onto the side of my cabin," she said carefully. "Which happens to be adjacent to yours." He rubbed the back of his neck, and she could see the effort he was making to remain measured. "Miss Talmadge, we spoke about this, about proximity. You spoke about proximity, I listened, and then I made a decision about my own land. There is barely 8 feet between where your wall will be and my cabin wall. That is sufficient distance for a path, a bit of garden, and a fence if you want one," she said. "I have no plans to build onto your cabin, Mr. Brooks. I am building onto mine." It was here that the scene she had been playing in her head finally happened. He crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides and took her wrist, not cruel, but certain, and said in a voice barely above a whisper that if she knew what he was hiding in that cabin, she would not want to be within 100 miles of it or of him. She had looked into his face and found terror. "Then tell me," she had said. "Tell me what is so terrible about yourself that a woman with a hammer frightens you." He had let go of her wrist and walked back inside and shut the door, and the hammer had fallen from her hand into the dirt, and she had stood there in the Montana summer with sawdust in her hair and the half-built frame of her room rising around her. She stood there for a long time after the door closed. Then she picked up the hammer. She worked for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, working past the point where the light was good enough for detail work, working until her arms ached and her hands were numb, and the stars had come out cold and dense above the Montana plain. She worked because she had learned in the years since James died that there was a kind of grief and a kind of fear that could only be outlasted through motion, and that stopping was the thing to be most afraid of. She did not know what Martin Brooks was hiding. She had spent 2 months building a working picture of him from observation and proximity, and nothing in that picture prepared her for the word terror on his face. Not reluctance, not preference for solitude, not the habitual withdrawal of a private man terror. Something in his cabin frightened him, something he was carrying that he had chosen to carry alone. She had seen that quality in men before, the ones who had done something they could not speak of. James had known men like that from his printing days, men who had come through events that left their marks in ways you could see if you were paying attention. But Martin Brooks was not a criminal, of that she was instinctively, firmly certain. Whatever he was hiding was not guilt. It was something else. She fell asleep in her soddy that night with her hands still aching and the answer still out of reach. In the morning she found a paper slipped under her door. It was a single sheet, folded twice. The handwriting was strong and controlled, the hand of someone who had learned to write carefully and had kept the habit. It said, "There is a man who comes through Harding Flats every few months. His name is Decker. He believes I have something that belongs to him. He is not a man who accepts no for an answer, and he is not a man who comes alone. If you are to be my neighbor, close neighbor, you deserve to know this. I have been keeping this from town because the fewer people involved, the less danger there is. I have been keeping it from you because you did not ask, and I hoped you would not be close enough to matter. You are close enough to matter now. I am sorry. If you decide to move your build, I understand. I will not think less of you for it." She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands for a long moment. Then she put it in her coat pocket, walked to his door and knocked. He opened it. He looked like a man who had not slept much, and he had the contained expression of someone who has done something they are not sure was wise and cannot undo it now. "Tell me about Decker," she said. He stepped back from the door. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was measuring and uncertain, and underneath those things, relieved in a way he was clearly trying not to show. "Come in," he said. She stepped into his cabin for the first time. It was orderly and spare, in the way of a man who has thought carefully about what he needs and eliminated everything else. There was a table and 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, a shelf of books, more books than she expected, enough to make her revise her picture of him upward in some way she could not immediately articulate. There was a rifle above the door and a revolver on the shelf next to the books, both maintained and accessible. And against the back wall, occupying a space she had not noticed initially because he had been standing in front of it, there was a locked chest. Martin sat in one of the chairs. She sat in the other. "4 years ago," he said, "I worked for a man named Clement Decker, cattle brokerage out of Cheyenne. I was his head bookkeeper." He looked at the table as he spoke, and she could see the cost of saying this, the way a private man pays for disclosure. Decker was not, the business was not legitimate, not entirely. He was running fraudulent cattle contracts with the railroad, taking payment for livestock he did not have, skimming from government range leases. There were other things. He paused. "I did not know this when I took the work. When I found out, I took the ledgers. The real ones, not the set he kept for public purposes. I brought them to a federal marshal in Laramie." "You testified," she said. "I testified," he agreed. "Decker was convicted. He served 2 years in Laramie prison." He looked up at her. "He was released in March of this year." She absorbed this. "And he knows you have additional documentation. He believes I have the original ledgers. The marshal kept copies, but Decker does not know that. He thinks I kept them for leverage." Martin's jaw tightened. "The ledgers are in that chest. I have been waiting for the federal office in Helena to authorize their collection so they can be entered as permanent government record, which would make them worthless to Decker. But the authorization has been delayed 6 months. Bureaucratic problems, my contact tells me. In the meantime, he comes looking," Sarah said. "He has come twice, once in January, once in April. He brings 2 men. So far he has only asked." Martin's voice was even controlled, and she heard what it was controlling. "The asking has been polite because he believes that if anything happens to me, the ledgers go to the marshal's office automatically, which is true. But if he finds the ledgers himself and destroys them, the case against his remaining associates dies with them." Sarah sat with this for a moment. Outside, she could hear the wind in the pines and the distant sound of her horse moving in the small corral she had built. "When is he likely to come again?" she asked. "My contact in Laramie thinks within the month. The last visit was in April, and he tends to come every 3 to 4 months." She nodded slowly. Then she looked at him with the direct, considering attention she had been turning on problems all her life. "You cannot stay here alone indefinitely waiting for a bureaucratic delay to resolve itself. Is there a reason the federal office in Helena is not moving faster?" "Staffing, according to my contact. One of the 2 marshals assigned to the case died in the spring. They are understaffed." "Is your contact able to push from his end?" "He has been trying." "Do you have the name of the marshal in Helena?" He looked at her. "Marshal Alistair Ware." "Why?" "Because," she said, "I used to be married to a man who spent 3 years as a compositor for the St. Louis Courier, which happened to be the paper of record for 2 federal court cases in Missouri. I know how federal documentation works, and I know how a well-composed letter to a marshal's office, clearly laying out the time sensitivity of a pending evidence collection, can move a desk that has not been moved in 6 months. He stared at her. "You want to write a letter to the federal marshal?" "I want to write the letter that gets your ledgers out of that chest and into the hands of someone who can render them both safe and useless to Decker," she said. "Is that not the actual solution?" The silence in the cabin stretched out long and complicated. "Why?" he said finally. It was a bare question, stripped of everything except the actual need to know. "Why does this concern you? You did not know any of this 2 days ago. You could walk away from it right now. You could build your cabin on the far western side of your land near the creek and have nothing to do with any of this." She held his gaze. "Because you told me there was no room," she said. "And I have been making room anyway for 2 months, and somewhere in the making of it, I stopped being able to pretend that your problems are not also my concern." She had not meant to say it that plainly. She could see by his expression that it had landed more directly than either of them had quite planned for. "Sarah," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the way he said it low, careful, with a quality of sudden and unwilling tenderness, told her everything she had been trying not to be certain of for the past several weeks. "Write to Marshal Ware," she said, keeping her voice steady with effort. "Write today. Let me help you with the letter. We solve this problem first, and then we can—" She stopped. "Then we can what?" he asked. Very quiet. She looked at him across the table. "Then we can figure out what this is," she said. "What we are. Because I think you know what this is, and I think you have known for a while, and I think the reason it frightens you more than Decker does is that Decker is a problem with a solution and this is not." He did not say anything for a long time. He looked at her with those weathered, deep eyes, and she could see the internal struggle that a more practiced man would have hidden and that he was not quite practiced enough to fully conceal. "I have not been good at this," he said. "Being with someone. There are reasons." "I know," she said. "I have been watching you be bad at it for 2 months." She paused. "I have also been watching you try, which is different." Something finally gave way in his expression, not all of it, not the whole wall, but a section of it, enough to let the light in. He rubbed his hand over his face, and she could see the exhaustion in him, the long years of it, the weight of carrying something alone that was never meant to be carried alone. "Help me write the letter," he said. They wrote it together that afternoon. She drafted the structure, the formal opening, the clear statement of evidence in hand, the timeline of Decker's release and subsequent visits, the legal argument for expedited collection. He provided the specifics: names, case numbers, dates, the technical details of the ledger's contents that gave the letter its authority. She had a clean, clear hand from her years working alongside James in the print shop, and she wrote out the final version while he watched over her shoulder. And occasionally he leaned down to point at something that needed to be changed, and his arm came briefly across her field of vision, and she could smell sawdust and cold air and something warmer underneath that, and she kept her eyes on the page with a concentration that had nothing to do with the letter. They sent the letter to Marshal Ware in Helena via the express mail from Colton Creek the following morning. They waited. The waiting was its own thing, a particular quality of suspension, The way the air before a storm is not empty but full, charged with something that has not yet decided what form to take. They worked. They built. Her east room's framing rose steadily 8 feet from his wall, and he watched it rise without comment now, and she thought she saw in his watching something that was not objection, but its opposite, a covert, reluctant, poorly hidden satisfaction at the closeness of it. He helped her without being asked now. He came out in the evenings and worked beside her, and the silences between them had changed quality. They were no longer the silence of two people maintaining distance, but the silence of two people who were comfortable enough in each other's presence to stop performing. She learned more of him, that he read widely, that he had grown up in Ohio in a household that had been difficult in ways he did not detail, but that she could piece together from context, that he had come to the West the way some people come to a religion, looking for a kind of truth that older, more crowded places had stopped being able to offer. One evening in late August, they sat on the step of his cabin porch as the sun went down behind the mountains, and she told him about James, really told him, not the careful outline she gave to people who were just being politely curious, but the actual texture of that love and that loss. He listened with total attention, the way he worked with nothing held back for performance. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You loved him." "I did," she said, wholly. "And then he was gone, and I had to figure out who I was without that." She paused. "I think I came out here partly to answer that question." "Have you?" he asked. She looked at the mountains going red in the last of the light. "Mostly," she said. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and for a moment the distance between them was the same 8 feet that lay between their two buildings, close enough to feel, too far to close without intention. Then he looked back at the mountains. "I was engaged once," he said, "in Cheyenne, before the business with Decker." He said this with the care of someone handling something fragile. "When I testified, when the case became public, she ended it. Her family had connections to Decker's business. She said I had betrayed people who trusted me." His voice was level. "She meant people like her father." "She was wrong," Sarah said. "I know she was wrong," he said, "but it is a particular kind of wound when the person who was supposed to know you best decides you are not who she thought." Sarah said nothing for a moment. She sat with what he had told her and turned it over carefully. "That is why," she said. "That is why you said there was no room." "I did not," he stopped. "I do not know how to be certain that I can be trusted with someone else's. I do not know how to guarantee—" "Martin," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw what it did to him, the same thing his use of her name had done to her. "No one can guarantee that. No one who has ever loved anyone has been able to guarantee it. The people who claim otherwise are the ones you should be most suspicious of." He was quiet. "You told someone something true about what you saw," she said, "and she punished you for it. And then you came out here alone so no one else could punish you for being exactly what you are." She looked at him steadily. "That is not wisdom. That is just a very long punishment you are giving yourself." He turned to look at her fully then, and the thing she saw in his face was not comfortable, but it was real, raw, and undefended in a way that she suspected he had not allowed himself to be in years. "I am not good at it," he said again. "I know," she said. "I have been watching. I am not going to stop being." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the cabin behind him, at the whole fortified landscape of who he had become. "I am not going to suddenly become simple or easy. I have never in my life wanted simple or easy," she said. "I came to Montana and built a room onto the side of a man's life who had explicitly told me there was no room. Does that seem like the behavior of a woman who prefers simple or easy?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, the way a door opens when the person on the other side has been standing at it for a long time finally decides to turn the handle, he smiled. It transformed his face completely. That smile, it broke through the careful neutrality and showed her what was underneath, what had always been underneath, what she had been almost certain was there but had never fully seen confirmed until right now. She felt it in her chest like a key turning. He reached out and took her hand. He did it carefully, as if aware that the gesture was not small, that it was a declaration of something, that once made it could not be unmade without cost. His hand was warm and rough, and held hers with the same particular physical attention she had noticed when they worked together, aware, considerate, present. They sat there as the last of the light left the mountains and the stars came out, and he held her hand and neither of them said anything else, and it was exactly enough. The reply from Marshal Ware arrived 11 days later. Sarah was working on her roof framing when Martin came across the space between their buildings with the letter in his hand, and something new in his expression, relief, which on him looked like a man setting down a very heavy thing. The federal marshal's office in Helena had authorized an agent to collect the ledgers. The agent, a Marshal Thorne from the Helena office, would arrive in Harding Flats within the week. Ware had noted in his letter that the evidence would be formally entered into federal record, rendering it immutable and permanently beyond Decker's ability to suppress, and that he had been additionally notified by the Laramie office that Decker was under renewed surveillance based on Sarah and Martin's documented account of his visits. Martin handed her the letter. She read it on the roof. She could feel him watching her from the ground. "It is done," she said. "Not until Thorne gets here," he said. "Then it is almost done," she said. "Come up and help me with this purlin." He climbed up and helped her with the purlin, and they worked in the good, settled silence of people who have solved a problem together and are now simply continuing to build. Marshal Thorne arrived on a Thursday. He was a compact, efficient man in his 40s, who asked clear questions and made terse notes, and treated the whole affair with the brisk professionalism of someone who has seen too many variations of this story to be surprised by any of them. Martin brought the ledgers from the chest and laid them on his table and handed them over, and Sarah watched Martin's face as he did it, watched the years of tension pass out of him with the transfer of those books, like watching a man unload a pack he has been carrying so long he had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Thorne took the ledgers. He had both Martin and Sarah sign affidavits, which Sarah signed with her neat compositor's hand. He told Martin he would be contacted by the Helena office when the formal record had been completed, which would take approximately 30 to 60 days. He then left in the same efficient way he had arrived, and the cabin felt different once he was gone, lighter, as if the thing that had been locked in that chest had also been locked in the walls. Martin turned from the table and looked at her. She looked back at him. "You wrote the letter," he said. "We wrote the letter," she said. He crossed the room in a few steps and took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with an expression so unguarded, so completely open, that she felt a pang of tenderness so sharp it was almost painful. "I have been alone here for 4 years," he said. "I convinced myself it was what I needed. I convinced myself that keeping everyone at a distance was a form of protection." "I know," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "And I knew I was wrong from approximately the 3rd day you were here, and that frightened me more than Decker ever did." She laughed, and it came out warm and a little unsteady because she had been holding more than she realized. "From the 3rd day," she said. "What happened on the 3rd day?" "You were arguing with your mule," he said, "about a fence post. You were making a completely logical case to an animal that has no capacity for reason, and you were winning the argument on points, and I stood inside my cabin and listened and thought, I am in a considerable amount of trouble." She laughed again, and his hands tightened on hers, and she looked up at him and thought, "Yes, this is it, this is exactly it. This is the thing I came 3,000 miles to find, even though I did not know what I was looking for until I was standing in the middle of it." She rose on her toes and he bent toward her and they met in the middle, the same way they worked, with full attention, without anything held back. When he kissed her, it was careful and then not careful at all, and she kissed him back with all the directness she was capable of, which was considerable. And the afternoon light came through his single window and fell across both of them in the particular golden way of late Montana summer. When they separated, he kept her hands and looked at her with a new expression, one she had not seen on his face before and could not quite name, until she recognized it as the expression of a man who has just arrived somewhere he had given up believing he would reach. "I want to be very clear about something," he said. "All right," she said, amused by his precision even now. "I am not a simple man to be in a life with. I know this about myself. I am private and I am stubborn and I have a history that I have only begun to tell you, and some of it is not pleasant. I built a room onto the side of your life," she said. "I was not expecting simple. But I want this," he said, and the directness of it cost him something. She could see it, the effort of saying it plain, without armor. "I want whatever this is. I want you close. I want the room you built. He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "I want you to stay." She squeezed his hands. "Martin," she said, "I already have." They had 2 more difficult weeks before Decker came again. She was inside her now-roofed cabin, her east room still open to the sky, but the main structure solid and sealed, when she heard horses on the trail from Colton Creek. It was a Tuesday morning in mid-September, and Martin had gone to town for supplies. She heard the horses and felt something cold move through her that was not quite fear but was related to it, and she walked to her door and looked out. 3 riders. She had never seen Decker, but she knew him immediately from the posture. A man who has learned to carry authority like a weapon and has never stopped, even after the weapon was taken from him. He was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with a gray mustache and eyes that swept her property and Martin's with the possessive calculation of someone assessing what he is owed. He pulled up 20 yards from her door. His 2 men stayed back. "Morning," he said. His voice was pleasant. It had the specific pleasantness of a man who uses pleasantness as a form of pressure. "Morning," she said. She kept her voice even. His eyes moved across her cabin, across the east room's open frame, across the 8 feet of space to Martin's cabin wall. "Nice building," he said. "You the new neighbor I've heard about?" "I am," she said. "Sarah Talmadge, and you are Clement Decker." A small tightening around his eyes. He had not expected her to know his name, and now he was revising his understanding of the situation, and she watched him do it. "Heard of me?" he said. "Enough," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Is Brooks around?" "He is not," she said. "And I should save you the trip to his cabin. The ledgers you are looking for have been collected by a federal marshal and entered into permanent record in Helena. They are no longer here. Marshal Thorne from the Helena office came last week. You can confirm this with the federal court in Helena any time you like." The pleasant expression dropped away from Decker's face like a mask cut loose. What was underneath it was cold and still, and she made herself hold it without looking away, because she knew with absolute certainty that looking away was the one thing she must not do. "That is not possible," he said very quietly. "It is entirely possible," she said. "It has happened. The case record is complete and permanent. There is nothing in that cabin that has any value to you. Going in there would only add a new charge to an existing federal file." The silence stretched out to its limit. Then one of the men behind Decker said something low that she could not catch, and Decker turned his horse, and they rode away south toward Colton Creek, and she stood at her door and watched until they were gone from sight. Then she went inside and sat down at her table and shook for approximately 3 minutes, which she had been saving for when there was no one to see. When Martin came back from town 2 hours later, she was on her roof again, working on the east room's frame. She heard his horse, heard him stop, heard the silence when he presumably noticed the tracks of 3 horses at the edge of the property. She heard him come across the space between the buildings. "Decker was here," he said from below her. She looked down. His face was tight. "He was," she said. "He came. I told him the ledgers were gone. He left. 3 men, no violence. It is done." He stood still for a moment. "You were alone." "I was." He looked at the roof, at her, at the hammer in her hand, and she watched the tightness in his face move through something complicated and come out the other side. "Come down," he said. She climbed down the log ladder. He was there when she reached the bottom, close, and before she could say anything he had his arms around her and his face in her hair, and she felt the long, shaking exhale of a man letting go of something he had been holding on to so tightly for so long that releasing it felt like a kind of collapse. She held on to him. "It is done," she said again, into his shoulder. You should not have had to face him alone, he said. I should have been here. You did not know he was coming today. I should have been here, he said again, with the stubborn, specific quality of a man who knows this is not entirely rational and cannot help it. She pulled back enough to look at his face. Martin. I handled it. I am standing here. He is gone. You built a life here alone for 4 years and handled everything alone, and you managed. I can face one unpleasant man and his horses. He looked at her for a long moment, then he cupped her face in both hands, rough, careful hands, and kissed her forehead, then her mouth, and she felt it like something settling, like a beam clicking into place. I know you can, he said. I do not want you to have to. There is a difference. I know, she said. I like the difference. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Sarah Talmadge had ever known, which surprised her because they were also hard weeks. There was a great deal of work remaining on her cabin. The harvest had to be put up before the first frost, and the first frost in Montana came early and came serious. But hard work in good company is a fundamentally different thing from hard work alone, and she had been alone long enough to know the difference intimately. Martin had changed. Not transformed, he was still himself, still quiet, still tending toward caution and precision, and the particular solitude that was simply the texture of his character. But the wall had come down, the one he had built so carefully over 4 years, and what was behind it was, she found herself returning again and again to this particular word, good. He was fundamentally good, in the way that certain things are good, not performatively or because they are trying to be, but because that is simply what they are made of. He brought her coffee in the mornings when she was already up and working. He did this without comment, just set it on the nearest flat surface and went back to whatever he was doing, and she did not thank him verbally because she could see that he did not want to be thanked. He just wanted her to have coffee. She appreciated this more than she could have articulated. She planted her kitchen garden with an eye to next spring, getting her bulbs in before the hard frost and preparing the beds with the manure from both their horses, which was a sentence that would have meant nothing to her 3 years ago and now meant everything. She moved her root vegetables into the cellar she had dug off the east room, her east room, the one that had changed everything by bringing her 8 feet closer to a man who had told her he had no room. She moved out of the soddy and into her cabin in the first week of October, when the nights had turned genuinely cold, and the soddy, for all its practical virtues, was damp and low-ceilinged, and she was tired of it. Her cabin was not finished. The east room still lacked proper window frames and one interior wall. But the main room was sealed and warm. The stove was set and drawing well, and she had a bed with a real mattress that she had bought from Edna Crane at the boarding house in exchange for a winter's worth of preserved goods. She slept in her cabin the first night with the same satisfaction she had felt sleeping in the soddy the first night, but larger, and when she woke in the morning to the smell of frost on the air and heard, through her east wall, the sound of Martin moving around in his cabin, the scrape of his stove grate, the sound of his boots, the brief off-key song he was apparently not aware he sang to himself in the mornings. She lay in her bed and smiled at the ceiling with an uncomplicated happiness that felt like something she had not felt since before James died, or perhaps since before that, since before she had fully understood that life is mostly loss, and that the only sensible response to this fact is to love things very hard in the time you have. On an evening in mid-October, with the first real snow of the season coming down in large, quiet flakes, and the stove in her cabin filling the room with warmth, Martin came and knocked at her door. She opened it to find him with a bottle of whiskey he had been given by the blacksmith in Colton Creek for helping to reset the forge, which was a high-value payment that indicated how much the job had needed doing. "I think we should celebrate," he said. He looked very slightly uncertain, which she had learned to recognize as his version of hopeful. "The ledgers," she said. "The ledgers," he said, "and other things if you want." She opened the door wide. "Come in," she said. He sat across from her at her table, and she poured 2 careful measures of whiskey into 2 tin cups, and they looked at each other across the candlelight with the easy, settled intimacy of 2 people who have been working toward each other for months and have finally arrived. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. He turned his cup in his hands, looking at it, in the way he had when he was finding words for something. "My father used to say that a man who cannot be alone is a weak man. And I took that very much to heart, and I went a long way in the direction he was pointing. Too far." He looked up. "I do not think that anymore. I think a man who cannot let anyone in is not strong, he is just afraid." "Yes," she said. "I was afraid," he said, "for a long time, and you came and put your foundation down 19.5 feet from my door and then 8 feet from my door, and you would not move, and I could not keep being afraid and also be in your proximity. It was too much to hold at once." She set her cup down. "Martin, I love you," he said. He said it the way he said most important things, plainly, directly, without embellishment. I wanted to say it clearly. I am not good at unclear. She felt tears come, which surprised her because she was not in general a woman who cried easily. She felt them rise in her throat, and she let them because she had also learned in the years since James that refusing to feel things was just another kind of running away. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I thought if I kept building, eventually you would see it." "I saw it," he said. "I was terrified." "I know," she said. "I watched you be terrified. You were very dignified about it." He laughed, the full, genuine laugh she had heard only a handful of times, the one that changed his entire face and made him look like the person he was underneath all the years of caution. She reached across the table and took his hand. "What happens now?" he said. "You finished telling me the parts of your history you have not told me yet," she said, "and I will finish telling you mine, and we continue to build things individually and together, and we see what we become." He looked at their joined hands on the table. "I would like to ask you something more specific than that," he said carefully. "When the time is right, when you are certain." "Martin," she said, "I built a room onto the side of your life. I think you can reasonably consider me certain." He met her eyes, and the smile came back, slower this time and deeper, and she thought, there it is. There is the man who was in there all along, the one the fear had been sitting in front of for 4 years. And now she could see him clearly, and she intended to go on seeing him for as long as she had. The snow came down outside and piled up on both their rooftops, his and hers, with only 8 feet between them. Martin Brooks asked Sarah Talmadge to marry him on the first proper clear day of November, standing in the space between their 2 buildings in 6 inches of snow, without ceremony or preparation, because he had apparently woken up that morning and decided that waiting was no longer something he was willing to do. He asked her practically framed in terms of making the 2 properties a single legal holding, which was efficient and sensible, and then immediately seemed to realize how unromantic this sounded and added, with a slightly desperate quality, "But also because I cannot imagine not having you here. Every morning. For the rest of whatever time there is." She said yes. She said it immediately and completely, and then she said, "The property argument was sound also, for the record." He pulled her into his arms in the snow with a relief that was almost comic in its completeness, and she laughed with her face against his chest, and he held on with both arms, and she thought, "This is it. This is exactly the room I was making." They were married in December in the small church in Harding Flats, in a ceremony conducted by the Methodist minister who came through on his circuit and who had performed, by his own count, 42 frontier weddings and had strong opinions about keeping them brief in winter. There were approximately 15 people in attendance: Edna Crane, the blacksmith and his wife, the Dortmund family from the land office, several ranchers from the surrounding area who had known Martin at a distance for years and were, Sarah suspected, viewing the whole event with some combination of astonishment and genuine pleasure. Sarah wore a blue wool dress she had ordered from a catalog in October, which had arrived 3 days before the wedding, which she chose to read as a good omen. Martin wore his good shirt and a coat she had not seen before and had clearly pressed, which told her things about him she found very touching. The minister kept it brief, as promised. Martin held her hands through the whole ceremony with the same careful certainty he had held them the first time on the porch, and when he said the words he said them looking directly at her, not at the minister or the gathered witnesses or the middle distance, but at her, with total attention, as if there was nothing else in the room worth looking at. She said her own words looking straight back at him. When it was over and they walked back out into the December cold together, she took his arm and he covered her hand with his, and Edna Crane, behind them, said something that made two of the ranchers laugh, and the horses stamped in the cold, and the sky above Montana was the absolute blue of winter. They went home to their two cabins, which were also one home now. Martin moved the wall between the east room and his cabin. They had been working on the connection for 2 months, a doorway that would link her structure to his, turning two separate buildings into one extended home. It was not a small project. It required structural thought and careful execution and several evenings of deliberation over diagrams. When they finally opened the passage between the two spaces, standing on either side of the new doorway and looking at each other through it, Sarah felt something click into place that went beyond architecture. "Well," Martin said, leaning in the new doorframe. "Here we are. Here we are," she agreed. She crossed through the doorway into his space, which was now also her space, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together looking at the combined length of their joined home. Her room on the east, the passageway, his main room, the kitchen she had helped him reorganize with the second pair of hands he had never had before. And it was not a large house, but it was a good one, built by two careful people over the course of a season, and it was completely and thoroughly theirs. They spent that winter in the warmth of their joined home, and Sarah finished coming to know Martin in the way you can only come to know a person when you are sharing walls and mornings, and the specific intimacy of daily life. She learned that he had been born in 1848 in Cincinnati, that his father had been a hard man and his mother a kind one, and that he had loved his mother with a devotion that had quietly shaped the whole of his character. She learned that the fire that had burned his arm had happened in the print house in Cheyenne, before the Decker matter, and had been the kind of thing that simply happened in a world of oil lamps and sawdust and bad luck, and that he had gone back to work the following week because stopping had seemed worse than the pain. She told him in return about growing up in Massachusetts in a house full of books and not much money, about her mother who had taught her to read before she was 4 and to argue before she was 6, about the circumstances that had brought her to St. Louis and to James and to the printing trade, and eventually to the road west. She told him about the specific texture of grief, not the dramatic parts which she had already told him, but the quiet parts, the way you reach for something and find absence, the way a laugh sounds different when there is no one to hear it. He listened to all of it with the complete, unflinching attention that was perhaps the thing she loved most about him. The letter from Marshall Ware's office arrived in January, confirming that the ledgers were fully entered into federal record, and that Clement Decker had been served with an additional notice of federal scrutiny. The letter also noted, in the formal language of legal correspondence, that the testimony of Martin Brooks remained on file, and that any interference with a federal witness would be prosecuted to the full extent of available law. Martin read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in the cedar box where he kept important papers and said nothing for a moment. "It is over," Sarah said. "It is over," he agreed. He looked at her with a calm that was new, that was the calm of a man who has set something down and is learning what it feels like to have both hands free. "I think I have some rebuilding to do," he said, on the way I have been living." "We both do," she said. "That is what this year is for," he nodded. Then, because he was Martin and could not stay interior indefinitely when there was work to be done, he said, "The south fence needs attention before the spring thaw, and I want to extend the kitchen garden. It should be your side, better sun exposure." "I was already planning it," she said. "And the garden will grow across the boundary line, which means your squash will technically be on my property again." "Our property," he corrected, and she felt that word land with a warmth that never quite diminished no matter how many times she heard it. Spring came to the Montana Territory the way it always did, violently, with mud and snowmelt and a cheerful disregard for anyone's plans. They planted the expanded garden together, arguing productively about spacing and crop rotation in the way that two people argue when they are both confident and both right about slightly different things. The creek ran high in April and threatened the lower end of the south fence, and they sandbagged it together in the rain and the cold. And when it held, they came inside and dried off by the stove, and Martin made coffee, and she found that ordinary life, fully shared with the right person, was not ordinary at all but something else entirely. In May, Edna Crane came out to visit, which she had been threatening to do since the wedding, and arrived with a cake made with precious dried apples and an evident determination to assess the domestic situation. She walked through both rooms of their joined home with the thorough attention of a woman who knows what she is looking for, and then she sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee, and looked at Sarah with an expression of warm approval. "He is different," Edna said, with the calm certainty of someone making an objective observation. "I saw him in town last week and I thought, that man looks as if something heavy has been removed from him." "It has," Sarah said. "And you?" Edna said. "How are you?" Sarah thought about this honestly. She was 27 years old, married to a man she genuinely loved, living on land that was hers and his and theirs, in a country that was hard and beautiful and did not apologize for being either. She had built a room with her own hands and filled it with her own life, and then opened a door through the wall and invited that life to join with someone else's, and the joining had been better than she had believed possible. "I am very well," she said, and meant it entirely. Martin came in from the corral as Edna was finishing her second cup of coffee, and he greeted Edna with his characteristic brief directness. And then he crossed to where Sarah was standing by the stove and put his hand against the small of her back with the casual, natural ease of a man for whom this gesture has become the most ordinary thing in the world. And Edna Crane saw it and smiled into her coffee cup and said nothing. In the summer of 1884, a year after Sarah had arrived in Harding Flats, she told Martin she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening after supper, while they were sitting on the joined porch they had built along the front of both structures in the spring, a long porch now, running the full width of the combined home, which they had built together with the same productive argument and precise attention they brought to all their building. He was quiet for a moment after she told him. She watched his face, watched the news land, watched it move through him, watched the expressions pass too quickly to fully follow, and then settle. "Are you all right?" he said. The question had everything in it. "I am," she said. "I am very well, a little tired sometimes." He took her hand and held it the way he held everything, carefully and entirely. He looked at the mountains and the long grass and the space between their porch and the tree line where the evening was drawing itself in. "I did not let myself want this," he said. "For a long time I did not let myself want anything that could be taken." "I know," she said. "I want this very much," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together on the porch of the home they had built between them, and the summer evening was warm and smelled of pine and fresh grass and the particular sweetness of well-turned garden soil. Their son was born in March of 1885, delivered by the midwife from Colton Creek, a steady woman named Clara Jessup, who had delivered half the territory's children, and had the calm authority of someone who has watched enough beginnings to be unafraid of them. It was a long night, and Martin sat outside the door of the east room, Sarah's room, which had been arranged as the birth room for the full length of it, and she could hear him occasionally get up and pace and then sit back down. And the fact of his pacing, the fact that the waiting was so difficult for him, was one of the things she loved most about the whole long night. When Clara brought him in, Sarah was exhausted and thoroughly done with the whole enterprise and also, simultaneously, completely undone by the small, fierce, red-faced fact of the baby in her arms. Martin came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression she had never seen on his face before, open to the point of vulnerability, full of something that had no armor over it at all. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, the way he said most important things. The baby regarded him with the unfocused, serious attention of the recently arrived. "What do you want to call him?" Sarah said. Martin looked at her. "I had thought, if you agree, William." "My mother's family name." "William Brooks," she said. "I like it." William Brooks grew into himself in the way of children who have two attentive parents and good land and a home that was built with intention steadily, solidly, with a character that was his own. He had Martin's dark hair and Sarah's directness, and he had the run of two combined structures and a large garden and two horses, and a mule named whatever the current mule was named, and he collected this small world with the thorough interest of a child who is being carefully taught to pay attention. Martin was a good father in the way he was good at everything, thoroughly, without performance, with his complete attention. He taught William to work and to read and to identify every tree in the Montana Territory by bark and leaf, and he taught him to treat animals with consideration and to think through problems before applying force. He taught him these things the way Martin had learned most things, not in formal instruction but in working alongside, which Sarah thought was probably the best way there was. She watched them together sometimes from the kitchen window, Martin and William in the garden or the corral, or at the workbench Martin had built in the barn, and felt the particular fullness of a woman who has built her life on ground she chose and knows it was good ground. They worked the land together in the years that followed, expanding the homestead as the territory around them developed and changed. A proper road came through Harding Flats in 1886, connecting it more firmly to Colton Creek and to the wider world, and the town grew around them incrementally. A new school, a better general store, a doctor who came and stayed. Sarah helped organize the school committee, and Martin served 2 terms on the small town council that formed in the late 1880s. Both of which surprised the people who had known him as a solitary figure, but did not surprise Sarah, who had always known that his withdrawal had been circumstantial and not essential. Decker died in Cheyenne in 1887, a heart event, according to a brief notice in the territorial paper, and when Sarah told Martin, he sat with it for a moment and then said, "I hope he had some peace at the end," in a voice that was neither warm nor cold, just the voice of a man who is looking at something from a considered distance. She thought it was exactly the right thing to say, and loved him for saying it. In 1888, their daughter arrived, a bright, relentless girl they named Eleanor, who immediately demonstrated that whatever quietness her father had contributed to the family character had been fully counterbalanced by the other half. Eleanor talked from the moment she was capable of talking and did not stop, and she argued everything and was right at an alarming frequency for a 2-year-old, and Martin looked at her sometimes with an expression of absolute bafflement and absolute adoration in equal measure. "She is very much like you," he told Sarah once. "She is her own person," Sarah said. "Yes," he agreed, "her own very loud person." Their homestead by 1889 was a real property. The 2 joined cabins had grown with additions over the years, a proper kitchen structure, a larger sleeping room for the children, a workroom where Sarah kept her writing. She had begun contributing letters and occasional pieces to the territorial paper on land and homestead matters, and Martin kept his surveying tools and his books. The south fence was solid and extended. The kitchen garden was large and productive. The horses were good stock, and they had added 3 cows, which William had named, and which Martin had accepted with the resignation of a man who knows his son has won this particular argument. One evening in the late autumn of 1889, with William 6 years old and Eleanor barely 1, Martin and Sarah sat on the long porch after the children were in bed, and the stars came out above the Montana mountains in the dense, brilliant profusion of a clear fall night. The air was cold, and she had a wool blanket around her shoulders, and her coffee was hot, and he was beside her with his arm around her in the easy, settled way of people who have been in the habit of this for years. "Do you remember," she said, "when you told me there was no room?" She felt him smile. "I remember." "And you meant it," she said, "at the time." "At the time," he agreed. "Yes." She looked at the stars. "I was so certain you were wrong." "You were right," he said. "You were completely right, and I was protecting something that did not need protecting, and you just kept building." "I just kept building," she said. He pressed his lips to her temple. "I am grateful," he said, "every day, for the stubbornness of you." She laughed, and the laughter went out into the cold Montana air and dispersed, and from inside the house she could hear William in his sleep saying something in a dreaming voice, and the fire popped in the stove, and the horses in the corral moved quietly. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. It was what she had said to him, the night he had finally opened up all those years ago. She heard him recognize it. "I did not know when I came here what I was looking for," she said. "I told myself it was land. I told myself it was independence, something permanent, something that could not be taken. And that was true." She turned to look at him in the dark, his familiar face, the face she had been learning for 6 years and was still learning. "But what I was actually looking for was this. I did not know to call it by name. I just kept moving toward it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am glad you moved toward it," he said. "I am glad you did not listen when I told you to stop." "I am glad too," she said. She leaned back against him, and he tightened his arm around her, and they sat together in the cold, clear night on the porch of the home they had built between them. The home that had begun with a boundary dispute, and a kitchen garden 4 feet over a line and a woman who would not accept no for an answer, and had become, in the years of building and arguing and working and loving and raising children in a hard country, exactly what it was supposed to be. The home that was hers and his and theirs. The room she had built and the room he had finally, fully opened. In the spring of 1890, a letter arrived from Marshal Ware's office in Helena. A final formal notice that the Decker case materials had been transferred to the Federal Archives, and the case officially closed. Martin read the letter and handed it to Sarah, and she read it and put it on the table, and for a moment they just looked at it. Then she picked it up and put it in the cedar box with the other important papers. The deed to her original parcel, their marriage certificate, William's birth record, Eleanor's, the letter Martin had slipped under her door the morning after their confrontation, which she had kept and would always keep, because it was the moment the wall had first cracked. She closed the cedar box and put it back on the shelf beside the books. Martin was watching her. He had his coffee cup in both hands, and the morning light was coming through the east window, her east room's window, the room that had started everything, and falling across the table between them, and he looked at her with the open, unguarded expression he had worn for years now, the one she had worked so hard and so gladly to find. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," she said, "that it is a very good morning." He smiled. "It is," he said. "It is a very good morning." Outside, William was already in the garden with the same unsuppressible early energy he had shown since he could walk, and Eleanor was announcing her presence from her room in a voice that left no doubt about her preparedness for the day. The creek ran clear and high with spring melt, the same creek that had first drawn Sarah to this corner of her parcel 6 years ago, that ran from the same source as Martin's and had been, in a way, their first connection, the simple shared fact of water. She poured a second cup of coffee and set it in front of him, and he looked up at her. "Thank you," he said. "It was a small thing, and it was everything." She touched his shoulder as she passed, and he covered her hand with his for one brief, solid moment, and the morning opened up around them. The wide Montana sky, the mountains going gold in the early sun, the clean smell of spring and turned earth, and everything still to be built and grown and made. All of it theirs. Every room of it, earned and built and kept.